Hello everyone and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having an amazing day, because if you're having an amazing day, I'm having an amazing day. If I'm having an amazing day, well, you should also be having an amazing day. And if I can have an amazing day in this brutal, dystopian, capitalist hellhole of Kuala Lumpur, you certainly can have an amazing day. As you can see, my hair's growing pretty long. Long enough to horrify the National Socialist leader of Singapore, Sir Lee Kwan Yew, peace and blessing be upon him, because Lee Kwan Yew hated long hair on men, considering it a sort of Western degeneracy, you know. In order to stamp out this so-called Western degeneracy, he even organized a campaign in the 1970s known as Operation Snip Snip, and we're not talking about the ball cutting thing, right? Basically, at that time, men in Singapore were not allowed to grow long hair, and they weren't allowed to listen to rock and roll music, which Lee Kuan Yew's government regarded as symbols of Western degeneracy. Which is funny, because this is very, very similar to the Protestants in America, or I should say the right-wing Protestant Christians, and Lee's government seemed to have very, very, very similar tastes, and very, very, very similar distastes, or dislikes, that is to say, right? And yet, somehow, long hair on men was considered a form of Western depravity, even though historically, men in Eastern cultures like the Sikhs or the classical Confucians of ancient China all kept their hair long. In fact, in the Manchu invasion in 1644, the Manchus gave them an option. Basically, you either snip it or you lose it, meaning that you get your hair cut in the Manchu fashion, you know, the Q haircut with the balding part at the front, which is meant to make it easier, actually, for a man to put on a military helmet, right? And you know the Manchus were a nomadic warrior clan. But anyway, the thing is that, many Han Chinese men were actually killed for refusing to cut their hair, because you see, hair was considered to be a form or a gift from one's parents, right? That you could not defile in any way. So the very, very orthodox Confucians wouldn't even cut their hair, right? And somehow, Lee Kuan Yew, the Cambridge-trained lawyer who has exactly the same accent as mine, ends up decrying long hair on men as Western degeneracy. Something does not add up. So basically, we all know that Lee Kuan Yew was a bit of a control freak, right? Lee Kuan Yew basically intervened in very, very personal matters. For example, who your neighbor was, you know, what type of language you used, how long your hair could be as a man, and so on and so forth. And basically, his rationale was that in order to create an orderly, clean, and proper society, such interventions were indeed necessary, and it's very, very ironic, because Western American Republicans actually love Lee Kuan Yew, despite the fact that Republicans actually supposedly hate government intervention. Yet, ironically, they seem to have a soft spot, even a boner, for Lee Kuan Yew, right? Every single right-wing American Republican with Protestant values seems to have a boner for Lee Kuan Yew. So I've always theorized that, you know, right-wing conservative Christians in the West don't really dislike bureaucracy. They certainly don't like personal intervention. They only don't like it when other people do it to them, but they don't mind being the ones to do it on other people, you see. But anyway, basically Lee Kuan Yew and his cronies as well as other Asian dictators like Mahathir Mohamad, Pak Chung-hee, and the people like that, ended up basically claiming the mantle of Asian values. Basically, when they were taken to task for their human rights abuses, for example, Kwan Yew was known for labeling anybody he didn't like as a communist, just like our National Socialist of Malaysia, Hadi Awang, who labels anybody he doesn't like a communist, including the DAP, the Democratic Action Party, which is quite absurd when you think about it, because that's like calling Bernie Sanders a communist, right? Lee Kuan Yew was known for galvanizing the people against communism, right? And basically using the Red Scare, the communist witch hunt of the 1950s and 1960s, if you will, in order to lock up his political opponents, such as Lim Chin Siong, Syed Zahari, and of course the longest serving political prisoner in the world, Chia Tai Po, who is still alive, by the way, who served 32 years in prison for rubbing Lee Kuan Yew the wrong way, right? Everybody he didn't like was a communist. As he said, we've got to lock everybody up, whether they're communists, whether they're language chauvinists, whether they're religious extremists. Well, if you don't do that, society would be in ruins. We would starve, right? That was his rationale. And all these Asian dictators like him, or Mahathir, or Pak Chung-hee, all use the mantle of Asian values. Even though, there's no material basis for enforcing a short British colonial haircut on everybody. There's no historical or material basis to say that all Asian men need to cut their hair short, right? Because that's really a colonial rule that was left behind, just like the Draconian ISA, the Internal Security Act, which is also part of the odious colonial state apparatus that the Asian leaders who took over after the British, who were themselves the intelligentsia during British times, people like Tunku Abdul Rahman or Lee Kuan Yew, they were the intelligentsia in British times, and the reins of power was handed over to them, right? They all used the mantle of Asian values whenever they were called to task about their dubious track record on human rights, right? And they simply said, well, you Westerners don't understand Asian values because, you guys like freedom, you guys like democracy, as if, people in Asian countries don't like freedom and democracy, basically. The most ghastly form of Orientalism, if you will. And basically, they said, you guys don't have a right to criticize us because, well, you're not Asian. You don't practice Asian values, right? But I argue in this video that their concoction of Asian values was really Bismarckian, or I should say, basically Protestant colonial values dressed up as Asian values. Let me explain. Yes, the Draconian ISA, the Sedition Act, and so on and so forth are all remnants of our colonial history that our current authorities, the colonial surrogates who took over after the British left, use with gusto in order to lock up anyone who calls them out. And they use the term Asian values in order to stifle criticism or basically weaken their detractors' arguments, insisting that, you wouldn't understand because you're a degenerate Westerner. And we Asians actually don't like freedom of speech, we don't like democracy. We don't like a society based on rule of the people. No, we actually like elitism, and we like, our speech to be suppressed, and we like, the big man on top making all the rules. That's supposed to be an Asian cultural value, which is the most odious kind of Orientalism, if you ask me. But today's topic is basically called colonial surrogacy, the highest form of colonialism. Are you ready? Let's go. Now, if you've ever heard of the Baling talks, basically these talks happened on the 28th and 29th of December 1955, and they occurred between Chin Peng, the Communist Party leader of Malaya, and the Chief Minister of Malaya, Tunku Abdul Rahman, as well as his two accomplices, David Marshall, the Chief Minister of Singapore, and Tan Cheng Lock, the MCA, Malaysian Chinese Association, which is an extremely reactionary party, by the way. Basically, the talks were meant to end, basically, the conflict that had been occurring since 1948, when, the communists were basically waging a protracted jungle war against the British colonial authorities of Malaya, right? And basically what Chin Peng wanted was for his party to be legally recognized as an official political party of Malaya. That was his ultimate demand, but his minimum demand was that, all of his comrades would not be detained if they agreed to peace. His comrades would be treated like any other Malayan citizen, and they would be free to form a new political party of their own. Of course, the Tunku, the Chief Minister of Malaya, who would then become the Prime Minister of Malaysia, flatly declined, or flatly rejected, rather, Chin Peng's offer, or Chin Peng's terms, shall we say. From the Tunku's perspective, as well as David Marshall's and Tan Cheng Lock, basically Chin Peng's jungle war was basically an illegitimate struggle because the British had already agreed to give independence to Malaya and Singapore, right? So basically the communist struggle against the government of Malaya was in fact a form of treason that, was illegitimate because the British were apparently no longer in charge, right? So the Tunku told Chin Peng that basically, if you guys would be willing to submit yourselves for re-education, hand over your weapons and become good citizens of Malaya, we will be happy to assist you in that process, right? But that was unacceptable to Chin Peng, who viewed that as tantamount to surrender, basically. And so Chin Peng said, we would rather continue our struggle because, this is not what we want, right? So you may ask, why didn't Chin Peng just put down his gun in Baling? And why didn't he just agree to join a Malayan political party like the MCA, the Malayan Chinese Association? You know how much right-wingers love reformed leftists, right? Chin Peng could have been a Datuk, a Tan Sri. These are honorary titles we give to outstanding individuals in our society, right? He could have retired very comfortably, but he continued to wage a jungle war like a jungle rat, basically, against the Malayan government. Why? Because from Chin Peng's point of view, the Malayan government was a bunch of British stooges, right? And he did not view Tunku as a British stooge, but as my friend Ken said, he viewed him in the same way one would view an honest judge in a corrupt system, right? Because the grand old party in our country of Malaysia, the United Malays National Organization, which is a reactionary party basically, the early members were actually comprised mostly of the children of the Malay feudal aristocracy, right? People like Tunku Abdul Rahman, for example, were descendants of Malay aristocracy. Tunku himself was the son of the Sultan of Kedah, right? So basically, this party, when the colonizers were around, the members of this party were, shall we say, on very, very, very good terms with the British, right? as well as the MCA, the Malaysian Chinese Association, they were on very, very good terms with the British as well when the colonizers were around. In fact, as I'll go into further detail in my next video, the new villages, right? The concentration camps where working class Chinese were suspected of being sympathetic to the communists, as well as working class non-Chinese who were suspected of being sympathetic to the communists, were thrown into, were also organized as a joint effort between the British and the Malaysian Chinese Association. So the Malaysian Chinese Association that Michelle Yeoh's family is part of is not a friend of the Chinese working class either, right? It is a bourgeois association that cares primarily for bourgeois Chinese interests. Although, you know, it's very much like the Democrats, or very much like the Black Lives Matter movement in America. And I don't mean to say that Black lives don't matter, but if you look at the leaders of Black Lives Matter, they are bourgeois African Americans who live in posh suburbs, who have no connection with the working class, right? But that's another matter for another day. So, Chin Peng viewed the post-colonial government of Malaya as illegitimate because the people that were in charge, or the people that the British were handing the reins of power to, were basically Western-trained technocrats from the feudal or bourgeois classes who were going to create two Malayas, one for the people and one for the elites, right? And Chin Peng, well, being the communist leader he is, of course, wants Malaya ruled by the people of Malaya. The 3 stars on the communist cap, what do you think they represent? The 3 races of Malaya, right? Malay, Chinese, and Indian, the 3 main races of Malaya. But, so, Chin Peng was viewed as a traitor. He is viewed as a traitor, of course, and you can't speak well of Chin Peng, in fact, without people giving you the side eye in Malaysia. Vladimir Lenin basically described imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. Basically, when capitalists decide to export misery abroad, when they find it's no longer quite as profitable in their own countries, right? For example, if workers in a first world country start getting rights and they start fighting for their rights, well, what the capitalists do is they then destabilize other countries and basically export their misery to those countries, right? And that's why the global north countries, which are the developed countries, do not like the idea of the global south, places like Bangladesh or Philippines rising out of poverty, right? They may say that it's due to cultural reasons that those countries cannot rise out of poverty, but it is global north countries basically that live off the backs of global south countries. For example, someone like a fashion brand mogul, take Giorgio Armani, for example. He sells his shirts for about $1,000 each, right? But where does his labor come from? His labor comes from people living in places like Bangladesh, right? Who work in sweatshops and probably can't even afford to buy one of his shirts, right? So they are alienated from the product they produce, right? So basically, just like imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, colonial surrogacy, or basically locals who are friendly to Western capitalist interests and who will uphold Western colonial morals, are also the highest stage of colonialism, right? Because when the British found that, colonialism was getting a little bit difficult to implement because the locals were fighting for their rights, there were armed struggles in the jungles of Malaya or, in places like that. Basically, what happened was, in order to pacify the locals, the British said, okay, we will give you guys your independence, but on one condition: we will appoint leaders for you guys that we approve of, right? So, basically, these leaders, who were colonial stooges in colonizer times end up becoming the new aristocracy or the new ruling class in these Asian countries. And the British can say, or any other European power can say, well, you see, you guys have got your independence. You're no longer colonized by us, right? So basically, at the same time, however, these colonial poodles will uphold Western colonial morals, right? They will basically serve as proxies for the Western colonizers because it is they who will be friendly to the interests of the colonizers and will also serve as reliable allies against communism in the region, right? So one of the conditions necessary for the British to grant us our independence, rather, I use the word grant in a very sarcastic manner, of course, was that our post-colonial leadership had to be people they approved of and people who were also hostile to communism, right? Because the British still wanted a friend in the East, so to speak. So you have the intelligentsia, people like Tunku Abdul Rahman or Lee Kwan Yew, who were themselves part of the privileged English-speaking elites during colonial times, taking over after the British, right? After the British have left. And basically, they claim that, you know, we're no longer colonized, and basically we now practice a thing called Asian values. And yet, funnily enough, you know, you will still see remnants of colonialism, right, in these places. For example, these bureaucrats who took over still enforce Western colonial norms on the people, right? These colonial surrogates not only serve Britain's economic and political interests by being a good friend against communism, but they also serve Britain's cultural interests by ensuring that the people continue to unconsciously subscribe to colonial Protestant norms while believing that they are indeed subscribing to Asian or African values, right? Because it's very funny when you see an African politician in Uganda, a right-wing African politician saying, we are doing this for ourselves. We do not want this Western degeneracy in our country. We want the homosexuals out of this country. And basically, we want Africa to be an African country with African values. And yet, at the same time, this politician is wearing an Englishman's suit. He's speaking in a European language. And basically, he's basically promoting a colonial rule. Because, you know, you'd be surprised, when colonizers first came to Asia and Africa, they thought the locals were degenerate, right? British colonizers were known for wearing suits and ties in the hot, blazing sun in Malaya in order to set an example for the natives, in order to dress in a proper Victorian manner, right? And yet, you know, the very same colonial surrogates who took over basically uphold these dress norms. Not only do they uphold these dress norms, but they also serve as a very, very reliable ally in the fight against communism. And basically, well, you know, if ever a socialist uprising of liberation, a true uprising in order to truly decolonialize the region were to occur, well, these people would be very, very useful friends of the Western powers in order to stamp out that uprising, right? A few years ago, I made this video entitled Colored Faces in High Places, which basically argues for the fact that just because you have a token person of color in a position of power, it doesn't mean that people of that same race are going to benefit as a result, right? Now, you'd have to be ludicrous, for example, to imagine that Candace Owens. Someone like Candace Owens would be beneficial to working class African Americans, right? You'd have to be ludicrous to assume that, for example. Or perhaps you'd also have to be ludicrous to assume that Andrew Young has actually done very much for the Asian American community, right? Because fundamentally, these colored faces are simply colored faces, right? You know, it's like saying Rishi Sunak is a man who represents Indian culture, right? Or Thomas Sowell, with the man with the name Sowell, represents African culture, when the man is a Yank to the core, right? Anyway, the point is that basically just because you have a colored face in a high place, it doesn't mean anything, because it doesn't really matter what color the wolf is if he intends to eat you in the first place, right? And it doesn't really matter if the post-colonial authority are colored Asian people, if they're continuing the British legacy, right? And basically keeping colonialism on life support by not abolishing draconian things like the Internal Security Act, the Sedition Act, or perhaps, basically abolishing even colonial dress norms. For example, when people are not allowed to basically wear long hair as a man, right? That, I would argue, is an obsolete law from colonial times, enforcing short hair on everybody, right? Colonialism ended in theory, right? Only in theory it ended, because the British said, we're leaving and we will leave you guys to yourselves. But in actual fact, right, colonialism didn't end, because our current leadership in former Western colonies are still serving European colonial interests, whether we want to admit it or not, right? And also, if Tunku Abdul Rahman had agreed to let Chin Peng become a politician in Malaya, and he had agreed to Chin Peng's terms, guess what? The British would have gone back on giving Malaya its independence. The British might even have had him shot, right? So in a way, Tunku, by taking a stance on being tough on communism, was actually also trying to preserve his own survival, right? So you can't really blame the Tunku completely, right? But you see, colonialism never really ended, because it's still kept on life support by the Asian people who took over after the British left, right? The official party line of Lee Kuan Yew's party, the PAP, is that basically until Raffles came around, there wasn't much of an organized society to call a society, unless you want to call a fishing village a society, basically. And many buildings in Singapore still bear Raffles' name, right? Don't you think that's curious? I mean, Hitler himself doesn't get to have a statue, yet why does Singapore use Raffles' name for most of its buildings, right? Why do we in Malaysia use colonizers' names for many of our roads or public places, right? Like Gurney Drive in Penang, for example. Why are we preserving this colonial institution? Why are we still using British colonial uniforms that have no historical or material relevance to our culture? And in fact, it would be far more practical and comfortable if our children could wear sarongs to school, right? And our uniform were adapted to fit the norms of Southeast Asia. But no, we seem to have this colonial nostalgia, you see. So we're not giving up on these colonial things because our leaders have colonial nostalgia. Our leaders would have been part of the colonial intelligentsia, sipping tea or sipping whiskey with people like Henry Gurney. Yes, you see, basically the leadership in Malaya or Malaysia. I don't want to be accused of being a traitor, so I'll say Malaysia. it's basically, it's basically a takeover. It's simply a management change that occurred. And you could say the same thing about Singapore. The leadership in Singapore is simply a management change from the British that basically used the mantle of Asian values, but in fact practice, well, values that were promoted by the colonizer, right? If you look at the keywords they use, things like, discipline, conformity to authority, and so on and so forth. These words, this kind of diction, you will notice also was used by colonizers. If you ever read colonial manuscripts, or if you ever read the words of the colonizers, you'll hear them saying shit like, oh, the locals are too lazy and indolent, and we need to basically drill our Protestant European work ethic into these lazy, degenerate, idle Orientals. So the idea that you need a strong man in order to keep the Asian Oriental masses in line is really a very, very Orientalist idea, actually. So, yeah. So if we're really, really committed to decolonizing, I suggest that we don't be complacent about, accepting that we are currently already decolonized, when the fact of the matter is that the Western puppies in power are still basically serving functionally as the colonizer's surrogate, basically creating one Malaya for us, the people, and one Malaya for them, the elites, right? And I intend to really, really decolonize for good. And you know what my first step will be after we socialists have taken power? The first thing I'm going to do is abolish our school uniforms, our British school uniforms, and adapt it to something more suitable to our country. The second thing I'll do is basically abolish these reactionary colonial dress codes in offices, basically. Not force any man, for example, to wear a long sleeve shirt and tie in the hot Malaysian sun. We've got to end economic dependence on the Western capitalist countries. Just like Thomas Sankara, the African revolutionary, said, he who feeds you controls you, right? And our leadership in Malaysia and Singapore are a little bit too close to the Western neoliberal elites, too friendly to the Western neoliberal elites for my liking, and for the liking of anyone who is actually serious about true decolonization. Colonial surrogates are not only dangerous in the sense that they hide behind the mantle of Asian values in order to suspend democratic processes, uphold repressive institutions like the Internal Security Act, and basically curb the freedom and liberty of the people. They're also dangerous in the sense that Western neoliberal establishments uphold these people as examples of proper natives. These people are often put on pedestals by Western academic institutions and are basically treated as the voice to speak on behalf of all people of their particular race. For example, take Columbia University professor Azli Rahman, for example. Raffles, the true grandfather of Singapore. When I was very young, every time I was asked to draw a hero or historical figure, I'd sketch a British colonial officer, Stamford Raffles particularly. I don't know why. I know now. As far as I could remember, I have never sketched a Malay Sultan. It would always be Raffles, the great founder of Singapore, one who loved the island to the core and wanted it remain the property of Britain. A fascinating story of the dedication of a man who wanted to see the island flourish by encouraging free enterprise. I made my own kites when I was a kid. I would paint it with the Union Jack, my favorite design. I loved to see my kite fly gloriously.
I love the English language. I love my English school and what it taught me. But Sir Stamford Raffles will always be one of the colonial figures whose life fascinated me since young. The life of a man with a passion for learning, travelling, and helping the natives progress through the ideology of British colonialism. Without Raffles and the British East India Company, where would Singapore be? Without Raffles installing Hussein as the ruler of Temasek, where would Singapore be today? So, the colonials did leave a good legacy after all. They mastered the art and science of empire building and colonial administration, and of course, science. Early science tied to navigation and mastered the tools of empire. That's my early memory of Singapore's great-grandfather of development, Sir Stamford Raffles, a man passionately in love with Singapore. A great man, isn't he? Who? Merdeka Reflection Number 3, a historical symbol of smart partnership, the national monument. Malaysians are glad that the country did what they did to the communists, the jungle terrorists, who wanted to take over Malaya and turn it into a godless society. The British intervened with the help of the Malaysian army, paving the way after that for the independence movement. We would not have enjoyed the presence of the Chinese and the Indians as a multicultural polity had the British not brought the hard-working builders of the country in. Of course, after destabilizing their regions. Through the Kangchu and Kangani system, it was meant to be a historical event and evolution, the making of hybrid Malaya enjoyed by the Malays and other natives too. Well, if your country is drugged up by opium, well, you kind of don't have a choice but to go to greener pastures, do you? The national monument, that symbol of cultural encounter and institutionalization. Oh, the communists did not like that, especially the Malayan communists, with figures such as Chin Peng, Rashid Maidin, Abdullah Sidi, and Shamsia Fakir. Oh, terrorists out to advance the ideology of Marxist-Leninists, the ideology of brutality and godlessness developed by Mao Zedong, who was trained in Russia. Stalin showed how brutal the communists could be. Imagine, without the help of the British, and what would be life be like for the Malayans without the smart partnership with the Malay Regiment. Would Malaysians want to live under communist rule, or even under Japanese rule, another brutal Asian power whom the overseas Chinese will never forget? We must thank the British-Malay partnership by protecting the symbol of liberation, the Tugu Negara, or the national monument. Even today, when critical race theorists, neo-colonialist activists, and wannabe Marxist-Leninists in Malaysia would want to smear our national shrine with red paint. Azli Rahman. Lord Azli Rahman. Didn't British colonialism bring good things to Malaya too? The English language, the language of Shakespeare and Milton and the Bible, liberal education, indoctrination, maybe not.
Rahman is what you would call, at least what the British colonizer would call, a good, proper, enlightened native because of his staunch anti-communist line as well as his constant heaping of praise upon the British Empire and British colonialism. Rahman is basically treated as a voice that represents the entire Malaysian community. But I will tell you first of all that the bourgeois westernized elites in our country that have no care or concern for the working class are in no way representative of all Malaysian people, right? Second of all, these colonial, or I should say these colonial surrogates oftentimes speak on behalf of their people and portray their own people in a manner that would not be acceptable. For example, if a white person had done it. For example, in Amy Tan's The Joy Luck Club, Chinese people, especially Chinese men, are portrayed as being cruel, oppressive, and vile creatures that no white author or black author would get away with if they'd ever written that about Chinese men. But because Amy Tan happens to be Chinese, well, that's all right. To white liberals, that's perfectly all right, because she apparently has a right to speak on behalf of her race. Well, by that logic, Thomas Sowell has a right to speak on behalf of the black experience in America, doesn't he? I mean, Sowell is literally a Jim Crow apologist, right? You ever read White Liberals and Black Rednecks? You will see that he even makes apologia for Jim Crow, blaming Jim Crow not on white racism, but on badly behaved blacks, right? So the idea that, you know, a person of color has the right to speak on behalf of his or her entire race is ludicrous, because do you seriously believe, for example, that someone like Malcolm X and Thomas Sowell are going to report to you the same thing on the experience of a black person in America? But inadvertently, it is always the colonial surrogates whose voices are amplified and who are given platforms by the neoliberal Western establishment in order to speak on behalf of the entire race or country of people they purportedly represent. It is usually the bourgeois elites who were in colonial times, whose families were cozying up with the colonizers, who purportedly have a right to speak on behalf of all of us, right? When in fact, if you had an Asian person or an African person whose narrative was not in line with the neoliberal Western narrative, for example, Chin Peng, do you ever suppose Chin Peng would be invited by Columbia University to make a speech? Would he be invited by Columbia University in order to make a speech about British colonialism in the region? No. But Azli Rahman gets to be a professor of social sciences, right? Because he reads the correct script, he says the correct things, and he is a good native. Not a bad native like Chin Peng, right? So you see, the colonial surrogates are basically the ones who are amplified and who are basically treated as proper representatives of the region they purportedly represent. And their victims, the people whom they have persecuted or bullied, are basically silenced, or their stories are kept quiet because they are not convenient to the neoliberal Western narrative. Like who in America is going to tell about Chia Tai Po's story, or Lim Chin Siong's story, or Jayaratnam's story, those men who were persecuted by Lee Kwan Yew? Who is going to tell their story? No one. Simply because their story is not convenient to the neoliberal Western narrative. Like, you honestly, you have to be the biggest fool in the world if you actually believe that Lee Kuan Yew was ever anti-colonial. Now, Lee Kuan Yew called himself an anti-colonial fighter only because colonialism, the expiry date of colonialism was on its way, right? But during colonial times, from the very beginning all the way to the end, he, as well as United Malayan National Organization and the UMNO fellas, you know, the right-wing feudal reactionaries in our country, collaborated with the British. They drank whiskey with the British. You can even see the second Prime Minister of Malaysia, Razak, in Japanese military uniforms. That's right. These people are what you would call Tali Barut, or Western colonial stooges. In the colonial times, these people would be called colonial stooges, right? But only because the British found that it was, too troublesome to continue maintaining their colonies, not least in fact, not least in part due to the fact that the communists were making it very painful for them to stay. Well, the British left on condition that the post-colonial leadership would be friendly to Britain's interests. The post-colonial leadership would be groomed by Great Britain. They would create an elite class of locals to rule over the rest and represent the rest of them. But in fact, these elite locals in fact represented Great Britain and her interests. Without saying, they represented Great Britain and her interests. As Chin Peng explains in his book, colonialism was past its expiry date. The idea of British superiority was dashed the year the Japanese cycled down the roads of Malaya and began a rout that would climax in the battering of Churchill's fortress Singapore. Britannia ruling the waves became a memory when the capital ships HMS Repulse and HMS Prince of Wales sank in a 1.5-hour South China Sea action off Kuantan on December 10, 1941. But the British would not face up to these realities. After the occupation years, they wanted to return and resurrect their glory days, as though nothing had happened to alter the course of history. Of course, they would make concessions to achieve this objective. Open their for whites-only clubs to a number of privileged natives, for instance, or assign a few locals to middle-level government jobs. Buy them with titles. Be nicer. Be more congenial to the brown or yellow person. But they would remain the masters and bullies. So-called agreeable and peaceful negotiations would have taken years and years if nothing had jolted them from their gin and tonic stupor. This is exactly what my comrades and I achieved. We made the British sit up and acknowledge that they had to listen to the true owners of Malaya. We forced them to the bargaining table long before they were even prepared to sit there. And that is how the colonial surrogate was created, you see. Just like the professional managerial class was created by the capitalists in order to lord over the proletariat, basically in order to keep the proletariat in line, the colonial surrogate was created by the colonizer in order to keep colonialism on life support and basically stamp down on anyone in Asia or Africa who basically went against colonial mores or challenged colonial institutions or challenged the Western brain rot of capitalism. These people's job was to stamp down on those people under the guise of Asian or African values, right? But in fact, these people no more represent Asian or African values than, well, someone like Azli Rahman or Thomas Sowell represent Asian or African values. Do you honestly believe that Thomas Sowell represents African values? So what's our solution to these colonial surrogates, right? What do we do about them? Well, I think the people of Asia and Africa need to be educated of their true history, not a whitewashed Orientalist version of their history. They shouldn't be taught, for example, as they are in Singapore, that before Stamford Raffles arrived, there wasn't much you would call a civilization. That's the official party line in Singapore, right? They should be taught about the great achievements of their pre-colonial civilizations. They should be taught to have pride in their pre-colonial cultures and identities. And furthermore, they should be encouraged to identify with the culture and traditions of their pre-colonial ancestors. That is to say, I really think that our uniforms, our school uniforms that originated from British times, ought to be scrapped for something more comfortable and relevant to our historical and material reality of Nusantara. Now, you may say that I'm Chinese, but as you know, I'm a Peranakan, and Peranakans have been here for the past 600, 500, 400 years, right? So I've been here longer than Mahathir has, in fact. So I identify very much as a son of the soil, a Malayan, if you will, or Malaysian. I don't think of myself as a pendatang or a newcomer, you know. In fact, the reason why there are so many racial tensions between the races, particularly between Chinese and Malays, and this is really another video for another day, is because of the Raffles playbook of divide and conquer, right? Racial tensions have existed since the dawn of time, but they were exacerbated by colonial divide and rule policy, right? By keeping the Malays in the rural areas, keeping the Chinese in the cities, and keeping the Indians in the rubber plantations. They were basically used in order to exacerbate distrust between the races, right? The idea of like the lazy Malay, the cunning Chinese, and the drunken Indian are all Orientalist colonial stereotypes used to play us against one another, right? And these stereotypes are also kept on life support by the colonial surrogates, who sometimes use race baiting in order to create distrust between the racial populations, right? You think that Lee Kwan Yew didn't use race realism? You think it's only the people in United Malays National Organization who are racist against Chinese and Indians? Lee Kwan Yew was hell racist against Malays and blacks. Some of his quotes are shocking. They even make people like Ronald Reagan look progressive and friendly, in fact, right? So I will even say that the colonial surrogates go one step further in terms of nastiness. They are even more vicious towards races or people they view as less than them than the white man himself. Because the colonial surrogate, right, as a result of the British creation of the colonial surrogate class, there came to be a class of people who believed that they were simply a special breed of native, who were simply better than the other natives, right? Especially the other natives of races they deemed, well, inferior, right? But in order to truly end race-based politics, I've said that we do need socialism, because socialism would sublate the need for race-based politics, because socialism organizes people on the basis of class instead of race, right? But the last barrier to ending race-based politics and ushering in socialism and defeating the global capitalist hegemony, right, once and for all, is the colonial surrogates, because it is they who will serve as the capitalist neoliberals' last line of defense against the people, right? Because it is they who will basically serve as reactionaries against progress when we challenge the capitalist status quo, when we want to nail the final nail in the coffin of capitalism or imperialism. It is these compradors, these gusanos, who will collaborate with the powers that be in order to stop us, because it is their rice bowl, you see, that they fear will break, right? So, no, I have no interest in revolutionizing the colonial surrogate. My target audience is really the working class of Malaysia and Singapore. I have no interest in revolutionizing the colonial surrogates. And yeah, they can go and join their capitalist neoliberal masters in the West for all I care, right? They can go. You know, these victims of socialism can certainly go can certainly run away to some reactionary country like America if they want to. That's where all the most reactionary elements of the global south go, right? But of course, we would need to seize their property first before they go, right? My proposal is that we make it a law that if they're going to run away to America, they can't take their property out of the country. Their property will be redistributed among the masses. You know, that or their land or their whatever will be redistributed among the masses, right? That should be the rule for every colonial surrogate that wants to run to America in order to escape being a victim of socialism, right? Yeah, that should be our one rule. But no, I have no interest in revolutionizing them. Now, if you are a colonial surrogate, but you're genuinely repentful and you genuinely repent being a colonial surrogate, that is possible, you know? I mean, I'm not saying that it's impossible to re-educate them. Puyi was a colonial surrogate. Aisinjoro Puyi, the last emperor of China, was a colonial surrogate, right? He was a colonial surrogate who collaborated with the Japanese in order to keep his throne, right? But if Puyi could be re-educated, I don't think it's impossible to re-educate the colonial surrogates. But I'm not going to waste time trying to persuade them to hand over power, you see, because these people are not the revolutionary subject, and these people actually benefit from the status quo. So why would they want to change a world that suits them so well, right? So yeah, that's it for today. Thank you very much, guys. And remember, a person may be Asian or African on the surface, but what is in his heart or her heart is really what counts, right? If a person is basically praising the virtues of colonialism and basically acting as if we didn't have any civilization before we met the white man, and we would be so much better off if the colonizers were back, that is also a colonial surrogate. But ultimately, colonial surrogates are not our friends. Colonial surrogates are our enemies. They are enemies of the Asian and African and Latino people around the world. Because it is these people who will sell out to the powers that be if the going gets tough, right? But is it impossible to re-educate them? No, of course not, right? Like I said, if Puyi could be re-educated, so can they. All right, thank you very much and have a wonderful day. Ta-ta!